Lena Carter stepped off the transport shuttle onto the war-scarred surface of Zaron 5. The dry, red soil crunched beneath her boots as she adjusted the strap of the satchel slung over her shoulder. The air smelled of burning metal and dust, remnants of the battle that had once turned this colony into a war zone. Though the fighting had long since ended, the scars remained. Crumbling buildings, deep craters, and the skeletal remains of ships that had fallen from the sky. But Lena wasn't here to dwell on the past. She was here to express her gratitude. A year ago, she had been part of an Earthlit humanitarian mission, delivering medical supplies to refugees stranded in the neutral zones between warring factions. What was supposed to be a simple supply drop turned into a nightmare when an unexpected pirate raid tore through the settlement. The soldiers who had been stationed nearby weren't obligated to intervene. Their orders had been to hold their position and avoid engagements that could escalate tensions. But they defied their orders. They fought. And because of them, Lena survived. She had never forgotten that night. The chaos, the screams, the blinding flashes of plasma fire slicing through the dark. She had been pinned beneath the rubble of a collapsed structure, struggling to breathe as smoke filled her lungs. When she thought she would die, strong hands had pulled her free. A soldier, covered in soot and blood, had carried her to safety without hesitation. She had never seen his face properly beneath the visor of his helmet, but she remembered the way he reassured her, the way his voice, steady and unwavering, had told her she would be all right. After the battle, the soldiers had disappeared. Their unit had been reassigned to another front, leaving behind only rumors of their next deployment. Lena had searched for months, trying to track them down. She had reached out to military contacts, bribed information brokers, and even enlisted the help of a retired officer who still had access to classified records. Her determination led her here, to a remote outpost on the edge of Zaron 5, where the unit was stationed for reasons unknown. She had no idea how they would react to her arrival. She wasn't a soldier, she wasn't part of their world, but she owed them her life, and that debt demanded recognition. Lena approached the outpost gates, her heart pounding against her ribs. The structure before her was a reinforced military encampment, built hastily but strong enough to withstand another attack if needed. Automated turrets lined the perimeter, their barrels tracking her movements as she neared. A pair of sentries stood by the entrance, their rifles slung across their chests. One of them, a burly man with a thick scar running from his temple down to his jaw, narrowed his eyes at her. "State your business." Lena swallowed the lump in her throat and squared her shoulders. "I'm here to see the soldiers who fought in the refugee battle last year. I owe them my thanks." The sentry exchanged a glance with his companion, a lean woman with short cropped hair who was studying Lena with open suspicion. "No civilians allowed inside," the woman said flatly. Lena had expected this. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small hollow chip. "I have a message from Colonel Duval," she said, hoping the name would carry enough weight. The retired officer had been reluctant to help her at first, but after hearing her story, he had given her a direct authorization code. It wasn't an official pass, but it was enough to get her through the door. The sentries hesitated before the woman reached for a nearby console and inserted the chip. A green light flashed, and a robotic voice confirmed. "Clearance level approved." The scarred man exhaled sharply and gestured for Lena to follow. "All right, but don't cause trouble." She nodded and stepped inside. The outpost was smaller than she had imagined, a collection of makeshift buildings reinforced with salvaged metal. Soldiers moved between them, some engaged in repairs, others in training exercises. Despite the relaxed atmosphere, there was an underlying tension in the air, like a storm waiting to break. Lena's escort led her to a central barracks and gestured for her to wait. He disappeared inside, leaving her standing alone in the dusty corridor. She shifted nervously, adjusting the strap on her satchel. The walls were lined with weapons racks, emergency supply crates, and a few faded insignias marking the unit's designation. A few minutes later, the door swung open, and a group of soldiers emerged. Her breath caught as she recognized them. not by name, but by the way they carried themselves, by the way their armor bore the same battle scars from that fateful night. Among them, one figure stood out. He was taller than the rest, his armor slightly different, a higher rank, perhaps. When he removed his helmet, Lena's heart skipped a beat. She had never seen his face before, but she knew it was him, the one who had saved her. His sharp, dark eyes met hers with a mixture of curiosity and something else. Recognition, maybe. "You're the woman from the refugee settlement," he said, his voice exactly as she remembered. Lena exhaled shakily. "I am, and I've been looking for you." A flicker of amusement crossed his features. Most people don't go looking for soldiers they barely knew. She offered him a small smile. "I wouldn't be here if not for you. I wanted to say thank you." The other soldiers exchanged glances, some smirking, others shaking their heads. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a cybernetic arm, chuckled. "Never thought we'd have a fan club." Lena ignored the teasing and reached into her satchel, pulling out carefully wrapped packages. "I brought something for all of you, just a small token of gratitude." The soldiers hesitated before taking the packages. Inside were simple things. Handmade ration bars, small engraved insignias, even a few bottles of a rare drink she had managed to procure from an off-world trader. Nothing expensive, nothing extravagant, just reminders that someone out there remembered what they had done. For a moment, silence settled between them. Then, the soldier who had saved her, who still hadn't given his name, spoke. "You didn't have to do this." Lena met his gaze. "I know. But I wanted to." Before he could respond, a blaring alarm cut through the air. "Incoming transmission. Urgent distress signal detected." The soldiers immediately snapped to attention, their easy camaraderie vanishing in an instant. The tall soldier pressed a communicator on his wrist, bringing up a holographic display. A shaky voice came through the speakers. "This is Outpost 9. We're under attack. Unknown enemy forces." Static crackled, then silence. Lena felt a chill creep down her spine. The others looked at each other, their expressions grim. "We need to move," the commander said, his voice sharp and decisive. Lena had only wanted to say thank you, but as she watched the soldiers spring into action, she realized she had stepped into something much bigger than she had ever anticipated. The moment the distress call ended, the entire outpost erupted into motion. Soldiers rushed to their stations, alarms blaring through the corridors as automated defenses powered up. The commander, the same man who had pulled Lena from the rubble a year ago, issued rapid orders to his team. His voice was calm, controlled, but the tension in his posture revealed the weight of the situation. He had been in countless battles before, but something about this attack unsettled him. Lena pressed herself against the wall, trying to stay out of the way. She had no place here. She wasn't a soldier, wasn't trained for combat, and yet she couldn't ignore the growing unease gnawing at the back of her mind. Something about the distress call hadn't felt right. The voice on the transmission had been frantic, yes, but there had been something else, something that sounded more like desperation than fear. The commander turned to one of his officers, a woman with sharp features and a deep scar running across her cheek. "Status on Outpost 9? The officer's fingers danced across the holographic console in front of her. Satellite feeds show no visual confirmation of an attack, no heat signatures, no ship movements in orbit, just dead silence. A frown creased the commander's brow. Then what the hell was that distress call? No one had an answer. The silence stretched, heavy with uncertainty. Then, a new transmission crackled to life. This time, it wasn't a distress signal. It was a warning. Do not approach. Do not respond. The enemy is not what you think. Then, the signal cut out. The room fell into stunned silence. Lena felt her pulse quicken. The way the voice had spoken, low, urgent, stripped of any unnecessary words, sent a chill down her spine. Whoever had sent that message had known that someone would come looking. The commander didn't waste time. "We're moving in. Full recon operation, no unnecessary engagements. He glanced at Lena, eyes narrowing slightly. You wanted to thank some soldiers, then you're staying out of the way. Lena opened her mouth to argue but stopped herself. There was no point. He wasn't going to listen, and she had no leverage to change his mind. Within minutes, the soldiers were fully geared up, their weapons primed and their transport ready to depart. The commander led the way onto the dropship, and Lena watched from the hangar as the engines roared to life. A part of her wanted to stay behind, to let them handle whatever was happening. But another part, the part that had brought her all the way here, refused to let her walk away. She spotted a supply shuttle being prepped nearby, its pilot checking the final diagnostics. Without hesitation, she moved toward him. "You heading out?" The pilot barely glanced at her. "Supply run to a relay station. Why?" Lena tried to sound casual. "I need a ride, just to get a better look at what's happening." The pilot raised an eyebrow but didn't question her further. He had likely seen enough desperate people trying to get somewhere they shouldn't be to know that arguing was a waste of time. "Strap in, don't slow me down." 15 minutes later, Lena was in the air, the supply shuttle following the same trajectory as the military dropship, but keeping a safer distance. From her seat, she watched as the outpost faded into the horizon, replaced by the endless stretch of barren terrain. The closer they got to Outpost 9, the more unsettled she became. The facility should have been visible by now, but there was nothing. Just an expanse of dust and rock, stretching endlessly beneath them. Then, suddenly, a shadow appeared. Not a structure, not a ship, but something else. Something massive, half buried beneath the surface of the planet. The pilot let out a low whistle. "What in the hell is that?" Lena had no answer, but she knew one thing for certain. That was not Outpost 9. The radio crackled to life. The commander's voice came through, sharp and urgent. "All units, prepare for engagement. We are not alone out here." Lena strained to see what was happening, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then she saw them, figures emerging from the ruins of whatever lay beneath the surface. They weren't soldiers, they weren't pirates, they weren't anything she had ever seen before, and they were moving fast. Before the pilot could react, the shuttle's systems went dead. The lights flickered, the controls locked up, and then nothing. The last thing Lena saw before the ship began to fall was the commander's team, their weapons raised as the unknown figures closed in around them. The moment the shuttle lost power, Lena felt her stomach lurch as the vessel began its uncontrolled descent. The pilot wrestled with the dead controls, cursing under his breath as alarms blared through the cabin. The ground rushed up toward them, a blur of red and gray, and for a fleeting moment, Lena thought this was where it would end. Then, with a last-second jolt, the pilot managed to angle the shuttle just enough to soften the impact. The metal groaned and screamed as they skidded across the rocky terrain, the hull scraping against jagged outcroppings. Lena was thrown forward, her harness biting into her shoulders, the force of the crash slamming her into the seat. The world spun in a violent whirlwind of noise and motion until, finally, everything came to a jarring stop. Smoke filled the cabin, thick and acrid, stinging her eyes and throat. Dazed, she struggled to unbuckle herself, her fingers clumsy and shaking. The pilot groaned beside her, his forehead bleeding from a gash that ran down to his cheek. He blinked blearily but was still conscious. "Move," he rasped, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "Now." Lena didn't need to be told twice. She reached for the emergency release on the side panel and slammed her palm against it. The hatch hissed before jamming halfway, forcing her to wedge herself through the narrow gap. As soon as she stumbled outside, the heat of the desert-like air hit her like a wall. The landscape around them was eerily quiet, the shuttle's wreckage steaming in the dim reddish haze of the planet's atmosphere. The commander's unit had landed ahead of them, and even from this distance she could see flashes of light as weapons discharged. The fight had already begun. She turned back to the pilot, who was now crawling out of the shuttle, wincing as he clutched his side. "Stay low," he muttered, his breath ragged. "If they took down our ship systems, they can probably track movement." Lena swallowed hard and scanned the area, her eyes darting between the distant firefight and the ominous, half-buried structure looming beyond it. Whatever lay beneath the surface of this world, it was no ordinary ruin. It pulsed faintly, a deep crimson glow radiating from the cracks in its ancient metallic surface. Something was waking up. She had no weapon, no armor, no combat training. Yet she had come this far, and turning back was no longer an option. A piercing screech echoed through the air, inhuman and guttural, sending shivers down her spine. Her eyes snapped toward the battle unfolding ahead. The figures that had emerged from the ruins moved unlike anything she had ever seen. Tall, elongated forms, their limbs bending in unnatural ways, their bodies shifting with a strange, fluid motion. They weren't using conventional weapons. Instead, their hands crackled with energy, launching bursts of searing plasma that cut through the air with terrifying precision. The commander and his unit fought with practiced efficiency, ducking behind cover, firing controlled bursts, but they were being pushed back. For every enemy they managed to take down, more emerged from the ruins, swarming like shadows creeping through the dark. Lena's heart pounded as she turned to the pilot. "We need to reach them." The pilot gritted his teeth. "And do what? Get killed?" Before she could respond, something shifted behind them. A whisper of movement, too fast, too silent. Then, out of nowhere, a force slammed into the pilot, knocking him off his feet. Lena barely had time to react as a towering figure loomed over her. Its form was even more unsettling up close, a mixture of organic and machine, its skin a shifting metallic sheen, its face devoid of anything resembling human features, its eyes, if they could be called that, were slits of pulsating light, burning with an intensity that sent a cold wave of fear through her. It raised a clawed hand, energy crackling at its fingertips, ready to strike. Lena acted without thinking. She ducked, barely avoiding the lethal burst that tore through the air where she had stood just a moment ago. She hit the ground hard, rolling onto her back as the creature advanced. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her mind racing for anything that could help her survive the next few seconds. Then, before the creature could strike again, a shot rang out. The commander. He had broken from the battle, sprinting toward them with his rifle raised. The first shot staggered the creature, the second sent it sprawling backward. Without hesitation, he grabbed Lena's arm and hauled her to her feet. "What the hell are you doing here?" he barked, his eyes flashing with something between anger and concern. She barely had time to answer before another screech filled the air. The remaining enemies, realizing they were losing ground, suddenly shifted tactics. Instead of pressing the attack, they retreated toward the ruins. But not in defeat. They were protecting something. The commander noticed it too. His jaw tightened. They're guarding whatever's inside that structure. The words barely left his mouth before the ground trembled beneath them. Lena stumbled, catching herself against the side of the wrecked shuttle. Dust and debris rained from above as the ruined structure pulsed brighter, the red glow intensifying. Something massive was stirring beneath the surface. Then, in one violent explosion of energy, the ground split apart. Lena shielded her face as the shockwave sent her sprawling. When she looked up, her breath caught in her throat. Rising from the ruins was something beyond comprehension, an enormous construct, half buried, its jagged form extending deep into the planet's core. It wasn't just a ruin, it was a ship that had been dormant for centuries. And now it was waking up. The ship's awakening sent tremors through the ground, deep and powerful, as if the planet itself was trying to shake off the weight of centuries. Lena barely had time to react before another shockwave rippled outward, knocking her off balance. She hit the ground hard, the force of the impact rattling through her bones. Dust filled the air, thick and suffocating, turning the world into a swirling blur of red and gray. Somewhere nearby, the commander shouted orders, his voice cutting through the chaos. His soldiers scrambled to regroup, their weapons raised toward the monolithic structure rising from the ruins. The alien constructs, those twisted beings with their shifting metallic forms, no longer attacked. Instead, they stood motionless, their glowing eyes fixed on the ship, as if awaiting a command. Lena forced herself up onto her elbows, coughing against the dust. Her heart pounded in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to run, to hide, to do anything but sit there as something ancient and unknowable tore itself free from the planet's surface. But she couldn't move. She could only watch. The ship was enormous, larger than anything she had ever seen. Its hull was blackened with age, its surface covered in intricate, glowing patterns that pulsed like veins of molten metal. Energy crackled along its jagged edges, and as the last remnants of debris fell away, it became clear this was no derelict wreck. It was fully intact, and it was active. A low hum resonated through the air, deep and unnatural, vibrating in her chest. The symbols on the ship's surface pulsed in a steady rhythm, as if responding to some unseen signal. Then, the silence shattered. A blinding surge of energy erupted from the ship's core, arcing through the sky like lightning. The alien constructs around it jerked to life, their bodies straightening as though an unseen force had seized control. Lena felt a jolt of terror as one of them turned its head toward her. The commander grabbed her arm and yanked her up. His grip was firm, unyielding, his face set in grim determination. "We need to fall back," he said, his voice barely audible over the rising cacophony. "Now!" She didn't argue. Her legs were weak beneath her, but she pushed forward, running alongside him as he led her away from the ruins. Around them, the remaining soldiers fell into formation, retreating toward their dropship, but the moment they moved, the alien constructs reacted. A piercing shriek filled the air, followed by an onslaught of energy blasts. The ground erupted in fiery bursts as the constructs opened fire, forcing the soldiers into evasive maneuvers. The commander spun mid-stride, raising his weapon and returning fire. His shots hit their marks, but the constructs barely faltered. They were faster now, their movements more coordinated, more precise. No longer mindless defenders, but something far more dangerous. Lena barely made it behind a collapsed wall before a blast struck the ground where she had just stood. Heat scorched her skin, and the force sent her sprawling again. Her ears rang, the world around her fading into a dull haze of sound and light. She struggled to push herself up, her vision swimming. The commander was already back on his feet, laying down covering fire, while the remaining soldiers pulled into defensive positions. But it was no use. The constructs were relentless, advancing despite the barrage of bullets and plasma fire. And then the ship moved. With a sound like tearing metal, its massive structure shifted, hovering just above the ground. The ancient energy pulsing through its frame intensified, illuminating the sky with veins of crackling power. A deep, resonant voice filled the air, not spoken aloud, but pressed directly into her mind. "The key has returned," Lena gasped, clutching her head as the voice reverberated through her skull. It was overwhelming, too much. Like a force far beyond her comprehension was trying to reach inside her very being. She wasn't the only one affected. The alien constructs had stopped their attack, frozen in place. Even the commander staggered slightly, his expression twisting in confusion. Then, all at once, the battlefield fell silent. The ship pulsed again and Lena felt something inside her shift. A memory, not hers, but something ancient. Something buried in the very fabric of this place. A flash of light. A war older than any recorded history. A weapon so powerful it had been sealed away, hidden beneath a world forgotten by time. And she had somehow triggered its return. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had no idea how, no idea why, but the ship had awakened because of her. The commander's gaze snapped to her. He had seen it too. Whatever was happening, whatever force had just spoken, it was connected to her. Before she could speak, the constructs moved again. But this time, they didn't attack, they knelt. Lena's breath caught in her throat as the towering beings lowered themselves to the ground in perfect unison, their glowing eyes fixed on her with something that could only be described as reverence. The voice returned, softer now, but no less powerful. The Guardian has awakened. The ship's energy pulsed one final time, and then the world fell into an eerie, unnatural stillness. The battle was over. But Lena knew this was only the beginning. The silence that followed was heavier than any battlefield quiet Lena had ever imagined. The constructs remained kneeling, their glowing eyes fixed on her with unwavering intensity. The commander stood beside her, his weapon still raised, though his hands had stopped tensing around the grip. He was waiting, watching, his mind likely racing through every possible explanation for what had just happened. Lena, however, had no answers. The voice had called her the Guardian. The ship had awakened for her. None of it made sense. She was nobody. Just a woman who had once been caught in a battle and survived because of these very soldiers. She had never held a position of power, never possessed knowledge of ancient technology, never commanded anything in her life, and yet here she stood, the focal point of something far greater than herself. The commander shifted beside her. "What did you do?" Lena shook her head. "I don't know." He didn't look convinced, but there wasn't time for further questioning. The ship was still humming with energy, its vast structure hovering just above the fractured surface of the planet. The glowing veins along its hull pulsed in a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if waiting. The kneeling constructs moved as one. They stood, their forms rigid but no longer hostile. Then, the one closest to Lena stepped forward. It extended a hand, not in attack but in offering. Lena's pulse pounded in her ears. Every part of her screamed that this was a mistake, that stepping forward could mean stepping into something she couldn't come back from. But some deeper instinct, something primal and undeniable, pulled her forward. She reached out. The moment her fingertips brushed the construct's hand, a surge of energy shot through her. It wasn't pain, but it wasn't gentle either. It was knowledge, flooding into her mind like a river breaking free from a dam. Images flashed behind her eyes, memories of a time before recorded history, of a war that had nearly shattered the galaxy. The constructs were not invaders. They were the last remnants of an ancient civilization, protectors of a force so powerful it had been sealed away, hidden beneath the surface of this world for millennia. The ship was not just a ship. It was a key, a vessel designed to guard what lay at the heart of this forgotten planet. And Lena was the last descendant of the one who had locked it away. She staggered back, gasping, her mind reeling from the weight of the truth. The construct did not move to stop her. It simply waited, as if it knew she needed a moment to process what had just been revealed. The commander watched her carefully. "Talk to me. What's happening?" Lena swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "This isn't a warship. It's a prison, and it's holding something inside." The words barely left her mouth before the ship pulsed again. This time the ground beneath them trembled, a deep vibration that resonated through her bones. Something was waking up. The constructs turned in unison, their bodies straightening, their eyes now locked onto the ship's core. Whatever was inside, whatever had been locked away so long ago, was stirring. Lena's breath came fast and shallow. She had no idea what she was supposed to do. The knowledge she had gained didn't tell her how to stop it, only that she had the power to. But how? The commander stepped closer. "Lena, if you know something, now would be a good time to share it." She turned to him, desperation clawing at her throat. "If this thing gets out, the entire galaxy is in danger." His jaw tightened. "Then we stop it." A surge of determination ran through her. She nodded. There was only one way forward now. She stepped toward the ship. The constructs parted, allowing her passage. The entrance, previously sealed, now pulsed with the same rhythm as the energy within her. As she approached, the metal split apart like the petals of an opening flower, revealing a corridor bathed in light. She hesitated only briefly before stepping inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, the temperature shifted. The air felt charged, humming with a force she could almost hear. The walls around her pulsed, as if alive, and the further she walked, the more she could feel the presence of what lay ahead. The chamber at the heart of the ship was vast, its ceiling stretching high above her. At its center stood a massive construct, different from the others. Its form was sleeker, its features more defined, and within its chest a swirling mass of energy burned like a star trapped in a cage. It was waiting. Lena knew instinctively that this was what had been sealed away, a force capable of consuming entire worlds if unleashed. She turned back toward the entrance, her pulse pounding. The commander stood just outside, watching, waiting for her to decide what needed to be done. She looked at the construct, then at the energy inside it. She had two choices. She could reactivate the seal, locking it away once more, leaving the galaxy safe, but always at risk if someone ever found it again. Or she could destroy it. She took a deep breath. Then she reached forward. The energy reacted instantly, lashing out, fighting against her grip. It was wild, untamed, an ancient power that had existed long before civilizations had risen and fallen. It wanted to be free. But Lena wasn't going to let it. She focused, drawing on the knowledge that had been burned into her mind. The ship's systems responded, shifting, adjusting, sealing around her like a second skin. She was no longer just an observer. She was a part of it now. The final failsafe of a prison designed to contain the uncontainable. The energy screamed, twisting, resisting, but she held firm. The constructs outside the chamber dropped to their knees once more, their forms vibrating with the force of what was happening. The ship itself groaned, metal straining against the pressure of the containment process. Then, with one final pulse, the energy collapsed in on itself. Silence. The light in the chamber dimmed, the walls returning to their previous dormant state. The massive construct at the center went still, its core now dark, its power extinguished. Lena exhaled shakily, her body trembling from the strain. It was over. She turned back toward the entrance. The commander was still there, his expression unreadable. "You did it," he said, his voice low. She nodded, her legs feeling like they might give out beneath her. "I think I just saved the galaxy." He let out a breath, then gave her a small, tired smirk. "Not bad for someone who just wanted to say thank you." Lena laughed, a broken, exhausted sound. "Yeah, not exactly what I had planned." The constructs stood once more, their glowing eyes scanning her, then the ship, then each other. One by one, they turned and began to retreat into the planet's surface, disappearing as silently as they had come. They had fulfilled their purpose. The prison was secured once more. Lena followed the commander outside. The dust had settled, the battlefield was empty, and the sky was just as vast and endless as it had been before. She had come here to express gratitude. Instead, she had become part of something far greater. The commander stepped beside her, glancing at her with something almost resembling respect. "So, what now?" Lena looked at the horizon, at the ship, at the place where everything had changed. She didn't know the answer. But for the first time in her life, she felt like she had found her purpose, and she wasn't going to run from it.